Chairman Mao, Jamie Howe, Ho Chi Minh, Asif Din, Václav Havel, Graham Saville, No Surrender, Percy Fender, Guerilla Cricket.
The Times literary supplement did describe The Unforgiven as a deeply humane book, accused of pocketing blood money to support a regime that systematically discriminated against people of their own colour. The players who went, of course, were banned for life from playing the sport they loved. In many cases, they were shunned by their fellow countrymen. Few turned to drugs, some turned to God. Others found themselves begging on the streets and struggling with mental illness. And our guest today travelled to the Caribbean to find the story of those forgotten men in the book, The Unforgiven. Ashley, again, a huge welcome. Thank you for joining Guerilla Cricket.
Thanks, Tony. It's an honour to be here.
Well, we're honoured to have you. We like having Aussies on the show. Yep. A few have survived, so you'll probably be okay. Tell us a little bit about yourself, first of all, before we get into the book. Tell us about you and how you actually came to write the book.
Sure. I think, along with a lot of Australians, going back to the 70s and 80s, the West Indies were always playing in Australia or against Australia. I mean, between 75 and 85, there was something like 8 series, including Super Tests at World Series cricket level. And they became our de facto second side. I mean, they were very popular in Australia. Obviously, they beat us quite a lot as well. Mm-hmm. But, they were our heroes too. So when we actually got a side together in the 90s that was capable of beating the West Indies, it became something of a rite of passage for young males to travel to the Caribbean and follow the Australian side around. So there was 91, there was 95, 99 and 2003. Well, I got there in 2003 and I happened to be doing some reporting at the time for a magazine called Inside Cricket. And it was actually the last 5 or 4 Test match series against the West Indies that Australia had played. And kind of sad in a way, but in Jamaica at Sabina Park, I got word from a taxi driver that there was a guy called Richard Austin, who I remembered from World Series cricket, and he played in Australia. And he was, the taxi driver told me that he could be found on the street begging. And I was like, wow, this wouldn't happen in Australia or England or New Zealand. And he took me to the place in the middle of Kingston. This is an area called Crossroads. And there he was. He was actually sitting in the gutter. And he was supping from a plastic bottle of rum. A plastic Coke bottle of rum. And he was wanting money for cocaine. But from that point, he told me his story about how he had ended up there, and basically he put it all down to South Africa and the fact that he'd gone there with the rebel side in the early 80s and came back, and because the reaction was so fierce, especially in Jamaica, he was ostracized and he couldn't cope with the rejection, even though he had a lot of money. And in fact, even at this point, he still had a house he could have gone to, but he preferred the comfort of running with a gang and pretty much just living in the gutter. So it had done horrible things to him, and I knew then that there was a bigger story to this. And hence, some 17 years later, I finally got my act together and got the book out, But that's kind of the genesis of it, Tony.
So it had genuinely been sort of gestating for the best part of 17 years as a result of that. His actually is, one of the things that has struck me as I've read the book is it is a very human book. It's quite non-judgmental, and it really focuses in on the stories. Some of them are very tragic, and you kind of opened up with one of the more tragic. I mean, he died, of course, didn't he, in 2015, rather sadly. There was one story about Richard Austin that struck me as just absolutely almost had me in tears, genuinely. His son came out of a restaurant and he was begging by chance outside that restaurant. So to actually, for your own child to discover you begging outside a restaurant, and then to a certain degree tried to help him out and look after him, because I think they'd been estranged, hadn't they? I mean, you would know more to the background than us, but it was such a heart-rending, just awful situation, really.
Yeah, it was, and further to that, just as a little footnote to that, Ricardo, that's his son's name. He's since gone missing in the last 18 months, which is very sad. And his mum, Molly Brigano Austin, who was obviously Richard's wife, would love any help in locating him. So if anyone knows of Ricardo's whereabouts, please get in contact with us.
Well, obviously an addiction to alcohol and an alcoholic father, and there were some sort of, shall we say, behavioural issues to do with a number of the players that went. I'd like to come back to that a little bit later, because there was I think a sort of a deliberate strategy to handpick more vulnerable characters, and hopefully you can help us decide whether that's true. But one thing I wanted to sort of start off by asking you was, of course, the book is so much about the rights of black people, tackling head-on the issues of apartheid, and the whole issue is built around whether missionaries or mercenaries, did they believe they were there to just make money for themselves, or they were actually revered when they went there. But let's start by saying the timing, therefore, of the book right now is incredible.
Sure.
Accident or design?
Complete accident. I mean, I had no idea for a start that COVID was going to happen, and no idea that the Black Lives Movement would take off at this point in time. So, but the good thing about that is that it has helped amplify the story of the rebels, and I think they deserve to have their stories told. They've lingered in the shadows of cricket history for too long, and this is their opportunity as well. So it's great that someone like Richard Austin, who only played 2 tests, is now getting. I mean, it's obviously too late in a way, but he's now getting the credit he deserves for a career that was sidelined by sort of political currents and sort of international politics in a way that he could never really have imagined. So I'm just happy that guys like him and Herbert Chang and David Murray and Everton Mattis, they're all getting their moment in the sun, and that's good.
There's a beautiful turn of phrase that I think you use in the Richard Austin chapter, although it could apply to others, I might point out. But you talk about earnest sympathy and benign neglect.
Sure.
That seems to sum up not just him, but many others, but particularly apposite to him. Tell him about what you were thinking when you sort of constructed that way of describing the way people felt about him.
Yeah, well, I think that it started off that because he was a guy from the ghetto. He was from Jonestown in Kingston. He was revered because he had made it out of the ghetto, and he was a rare example of someone who had done that and gone on and done good things with their life up until the rebel tours. And then, of course, after that, when he came back, he was ostracised and seen as an embodiment of everything that Jamaica wasn't about, and the West Indies wasn't about. But then later on, I think there was a feeling that these guys, and especially Richard in particular, had been treated too harshly, and that there was a sense of sympathy for what had happened to him, and a sense that perhaps people had gone too far. And I think that that they tolerated him, and now that they saw him as a figure of both mirth and mercy. You know, he was a guy that they felt now that they couldn't neglect him any longer, but they didn't want to get too close to him either, because it would mean that they were kind of tarnished. It was almost like he had a sort of leper status, and these rebels have leper status. You know, if he got too close to them and tried to help them, you would be tarnished, and you would sort of catch their rebel disease almost. You know, so I think that's kind of what I meant by that.
That wasn't necessarily consistent across all of the Caribbean islands. I think you draw a comparison with, I'm going to have to look at my notes for a second, you draw a comparison with Derek Parry, who came from Nevis. Sure. So in Jamaica and Barbados, you had a hugely powerful resentment. Before they went, I know Michael Manley, the Jamaican Prime Minister, of course, was a hugely outspoken, even though he was a big fan of one or two of the players that went.
Absolutely, yeah.
So some islands have been a lot less forgiving and continue to be unforgiving, whereas somewhere like Nevis, smaller island perhaps, seem to re-embrace and happily welcome back its kind of star. Why do you think that would be?
Yeah, I think that in Nevis, there's because the population is only 12,000 or so, there has to be a sense of community there, and they were very proud of what Derek Parry had done. He was a pioneer, along with El Camino Willett, who was the first guy from Nevis to play for West Indies. So these guys, I mean, you're talking about a very tiny island, tiny pinprick of an island, you know, a speck of the old British Empire, and any sense of their own self autonomy or independence, or anyone who could help them assert their sense of independence in this new world was a hero to them, and I don't think therefore that they wanted to bring him down in the same way that perhaps that happened in Jamaica, where there was there'd been a history of slave rebellions. There'd been the Maroons who'd rebelled against British rule and gone to live in the mountains of inland Jamaica. And as you say, Michael Manley was so vehemently opposed to apartheid that he not only wanted sanctions against South Africa because of it, he also wanted an air, land and sea boycott. He wanted complete and utter sort of ostracism of South Africa. So yeah, there was just a greater history of anti-apartheid sentiment, I think, in somewhere like Jamaica. But in Barbados, at the government level, there was certainly hostility towards the rebels. And when Malcolm Marshall and Desmond Haynes said no to Ali Bakker's offer of many thousands of dollars to come to South Africa, they were greeted at the airport back in Barbados by a minister of government who told them that they'd made a great decision and they were welcomed back as heroes. Yet at the same time, there was a feeling in Barbados, which some people consider Barbados to be a little bit more flexible in its approach to money and matters of self-improvement, and there was a feeling there among the people, at least, that these guys had a right to make their own living, and that they only had a short amount of time to make that living in, so they should be allowed to go to South Africa to make their money.
Well, it's way you could look at it, and it's massively oversimplistic.
Yeah.
But the players were the players not at the core of the, let's say, the West Indies elite for whatever reason. Some you could argue were unfortunate in that, David Murray being one of them, but for whatever reasons had sort of various behavioural issues that counted against him. But there were those who made money and were smart with it, and there were those who had made money and kind of rapidly lost it, and that somehow differentiates those in a way who have come out of it okay, and those who have been perhaps most scarred with it. Now, is that cause and effect, or are they simply related?
Yeah, it's interesting because guys like Murray and Austin, were into drugs big time before they went to South Africa. And David Murray told me that he used to get high before he went out to keep in the test match, and he said it gave him good focus during the day. So, some guys were perhaps always going to end up in some kind of turmoil in later life. But I think what South Africa did was it magnified any addictions or any sort of peccadillos that these guys had. I mean, it turned on a switch in their brains that I think wouldn't have been turned on otherwise, and they became, because of South Africa and not being able to cope with the mental side of being ostracized.
David,
it was a tipping point, I think.
Yeah, you bring that to life very, very well, actually, through, I think, the story of David Murray. Now, there's a number of tragic components to that, not least of which, is who his dad is. So perhaps you want to just, but the reason I picked in on him is the way you tell his story. He becomes almost it's the wrong words, but a tragicomic figure, particularly him and Collis King together as a kind of a double act. It's almost like, Lear and the Fool. And every so often David Murray pops up with, albeit drunkenly, sort of a moment of comic truth. Tell us a little bit about the interaction of those two, but also about the story of his father.
David doesn't share his father's name because he was born out of wedlock, and that's the way they do things in Barbados. And he grew up with his grandmother, as a lot of guys did. I mean, Derek Parry did as well, Albert Patmore, because a lot of parents moved to England, because England was a promised land, and that's where there was money to be made. So they're brought up by their grandparents. And in David's case, it was said to me that his grandmother really doted upon him, and he was allowed to get away with lots of things that normal kids weren't able to get away with, But he now is he's a very lovely guy, and when you meet him, he lives a very minimalist existence. He says peace a lot, and he says love a lot, and he's a very caring kind of guy. But as soon as he touches alcohol or he has too much marijuana, he just changes, and he becomes very difficult to deal with. And I think on the night with Collis, which was a fun night because Collis can handle his rum and David can't. David just became. He was sort of going in and out of almost subconsciousness. He'd come in with a very sort of cutting and insightful comment, and then he'd just sort of drift away, and Collis would be spinning stories, and it was kind of, as you say, kind of tragic comic, but I think David was a very gifted keeper. Jeffrey Duzon said that he made him look like Dolly Parton behind the stumps. You know, that's how good David Murray was. He was just so damn silky. But you know, Duzon replaced him because on that 81-82 tour of Australia, Murray was once again caught out, you know, with his marijuana consumption, and you know, he was missing team meetings, and even though he took a record 9 catches in the first test against Australia in 1981-82, then by the third test his career was over. He never played again. So yeah, it was an amazing sort of fall from grace. But yeah, it's interesting. I went to the go on, sorry.
No, I was going to say, one of the things you talk about was him crying behind the stumps at one point. When he was fully aware that even as he was about, I think someone came up to him and said, I can't remember who it was, but you know, after the first ball he faced in the tour, that's it, you won't play for the West Indies again. And he realised the kind of the enormity of it.
Yeah, Lawrence Rowe at first slipped.
Yeah.
Because David's a very sensitive guy, and in any bunch of 20 men, you're going to get some guys who can handle the pressure and handle you know, being called a traitor or whatever, you know. But there are going to be other guys who it's going to get to, and it's going to be difficult for him. And David's a very sensitive character, and it, as I said, it tipped him over the edge. It tipped Herbert Chang over the edge. It tipped Richard Austin over the edge, you know. It tipped Everton Mattis over the edge, you know. Yeah. But a guy like Colin Croft, you know, he to him it was water off a duck's back. Although I have noticed, you know, in recent times that he has expressed some contrition about going on the tours. You know.
Well, you mentioned Lawrence Rowe, who was captain, wasn't he, and therefore quite, I think, instrumental in some of the Ali Bakker's recruitment. Perhaps we should talk as well a little bit about the curious split in South African cricket politics and the roles of the different unions. But let's stick on Lawrence Rowe for a moment. He was a man who did apologise and then kind of unapologised very quickly on a radio interview, and had an honour sort of pulled out from under his feet, all of which seems to suggest the kind of the schizophrenic almost viewpoint that somewhere like Barbados has about the in one way appreciating and applauding the cricketers in what they have done for the island and for the West Indies, at the same time not quite ever being able to forgive them. And this one incident, which I think you know which one I'm talking about, kind of brings that into focus a bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. He said to me, and he still says to me, that that was the most embarrassing thing that has ever happened to him in his life. We're talking about the naming of the Sabina Park Players Pavilion in his honour, which happened in 2011. And it seemed like he had been forgiven. This was an initiative of the JCA, the Jamaican Cricket Association. And Rowe, who had sort of fled to Miami after South Africa because of the opprobrium that he got when he came back to Jamaica, and you know, he didn't feel safe there. And when he was in South Africa, he was getting phone calls from his wife saying there were threats to kill him and to burn their house down, all this kind of stuff. I mean, a lot of guys got that. So anyway, he was in Miami. He flies back to Sabina Park for the ceremony. It's during a test match. He gives an apology, which seems sincere, although ultimately it wasn't, because he didn't feel he had to apologise. He feels that going to South Africa was a good thing, and then it helped dismantle apartheid, and then it helped show white people in South Africa that black people could not only play at the same level as their white counterparts, but beat them as well. But anyway, yeah, he was there. He was there with his wife. It was probably the proudest moment in his life. But the next day, he gave an interview, and he likened himself to Paul Bogle, who was a guy in the 19th century. He rebelled against, or led a rebellion against British rule, and is a national Jamaican hero. And Lawrence said that maybe in 30, 40 years we'll be appreciated in the same way and seen as heroes rather than as...
Well, I think that's interesting. That's definitely something we want to come on with. In his case, did he not...
Yep.
I think he was already kind of a religious persuasion. But doesn't he have a sort of a church-backed cricket foundation that he now, even whilst living, I think, still in Miami, doesn't he, or somewhere in Florida?
Yes.
As one or two of the rebels do, not back in the West Indies. But he is giving something back to the game that gave him a lot.
Yes, and he has helped raise money for ex-players. In fact, they raised $6,000 for Patrick Patterson, who's not well and has mental health issues. And they were actually in the process of raising money for Richard Austin before he died. Lawrence, as I said, it really cut him up, the fact that his name was ultimately taken down from that pavilion, because what happened was that there was such an outcry from certain sectors of Jamaican society about him likening himself or the rebels to Paul Bogle, and ultimately the JCA was forced to take down his name from the Players Pavilion, and Lawrence went to pursue legal action, but it all got too complicated, and he just has to live with that now. But he feels that, as do a lot of people in Jamaica as well, because you got to remember that at the time in 1983, Tony, there was a poll taken, a Carl Stone poll taken for the Jamaica Gleaning newspaper, and that found that 68% of people were actually in favour of the rebels. It was almost like the man on the street was for them, but it was the church, the politicians, the media who were much more anti the tours. But the interesting thing about that stat, the 68% people who were in favour of the rebels going to South Africa, well, half of those apparently didn't even know what apartheid was. So,
it was one of the players was asked, wasn't he, what he felt about Nelson Mandela. You don't reveal who the player was, but the answer was something along the lines of, I don't know, we've never played against him.
Exactly.
So there was a sense of innocence is the wrong word. But what would be interesting is to dig a little bit at the sort of unusual circumstances that were happening. So you had, as I understand it, the South African Cricket Union, Dr. Ali Bakar. When the players were recruited, as we said, they were primarily fringe or edge players who were more vulnerable to approach. They went on 2 tours. But interestingly, they got a phenomenal reception. They maybe had to almost sign a document, and you all know whether this was true or not, to almost be honorary white men in the country, to allow them to be treated differently. But they were revered everywhere they went. They were treated as heroes. White South African kids couldn't get enough of them. So there is some strength to their argument, regardless of the financials and where they sit on that they were poking one in the eye of a hideously corrupt government by actually being heroes to white kids, yet at the same time they were actually supporting, albeit in error, the apartheid government that was using the tour as a kind of a smoke and mirrors thing. Talk us through a little bit about that sort of, because it's quite hard to unpick in your brain, that sort of complex mix, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Look, there's no doubt that the West Indies side were revered when they went over there, and they were hero worshipped. I mean, Collis King and Sylvester Clarke, probably the two dominant figures on the tours. Sylvester Clarke just about ended Barry Richards' career with his incredible performances, and that float ball that Richards could no longer keep out. But I think their athleticism, their joviality, their friendliness. This was seeing black people in a light that they hadn't seen them before. This is white South Africans. So white South Africans were used to the black people as miners or maids or servants or angry unionists, you know, that they hadn't seen this side of what a black person or any person could be, really. And so it was a revelation to them. And so I think there is some credibility in that idea that maybe white eyes in South Africa were opened by the West Indies rebel tours. But by the same token, black South Africa was pretty unanimous in not wanting them to tour there because they didn't want to have normal sport with any country in an abnormal society, because to them it was giving credence to that society. It was ramming home the fact that
it's the circus analogy, isn't it?
Yeah, you guys are getting off all right, but we're look at us and look what's happening to us every day. And I've got this magazine here, Tony. It's called Calypso Cavaliers. Can you see that?
Yep, I can indeed.
Yep, and it's a story of the 1983 tour, and there's a couple of press cuttings in it, and one of them's a letter writer to a Johannesburg newspaper. He suggests that the West Indian cricketers touring South Africa should be executed for the decision to visit the country. So you had some very extreme views, you know, and these were justifiably extreme because it almost felt like to some black people that it was almost like they were being mocked by having people of their own colour there.
He'd rather die than sell his soul. I might have paraphrased him wrongly, but the sympathy was there. The time's going to beat us soon, Ashley. That's the pressure of a lunchtime interview.
Yes.
I already want to have a stage 2 with you, if you'd be open to it, because I feel we've only begun to scratch the surface.
Indeed, haven't we? Yep.
I do want to just ask you one closing question.
Sure.
Which is, how do you feel ultimately that those rebel tourists will be judged? And having met them all and told their personal stories, how do you personally feel? So, you know, what conclusion have you reached in your mind and heart, and what do you think history has reached?
I think one of the good things about the book is that history is now more understanding of them and why they went, and they're not just seen as this sort of this group of monster rebels. Every player had his own reason for going, and often those reasons were hard to argue against. I mean, it's easy for us in the first world to say, well, you know, you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that because you're going to aid and abet apartheid. But it's different when you come from such an impoverished region, and this is a ticket out of poverty. I think to Alison Rudd in the Times, she said that the book isn't so much about missionaries and mercenaries, it's also about lost souls. And I think what the tours did was it turned guys who had bright futures into these sort of ghostly figures, these lost souls who ended up in the margins of history. And I think that's kind of sad. And I feel like this is giving the guys justice. It's giving them justice on a human level, not so much by the decision they made, because I think in hindsight most people would think that the decision was wrong in terms of these guys coming from the West Indies, these guys going to a country that discriminated against people of their race. You know, I think it's hard to justify that on a principled level, but
giving them that justice, I think, and that voice and that the explanation and the story around it has done them a huge justice. It's certainly done any reader a huge service, because it's a terrific book to read. Ashley, thank you. I'm just going to remind people that Amazon, any good bookseller will have this book. It's been nominated.
Any bookseller in the UK,
India, yes, no.
God, I hope so. I hope Amazon can get it there, but
okay.
At this stage we don't have
been asked.
any agent there.